Hello, everybody. Welcome to a special edition of Coffee with Krummenacher, the Mojo Nixon edition. And my name is Chris Slusarenko. I'm the host of Revolutions Per Movie. I'm a musician. I've been in bands like Eyelids and Guided by Voices, and I also owned a video store in Portland, Oregon for over 2 decades. And I started a podcast where guests would choose a music narrative film or a music documentary to talk about. Mojo Nixon had got a hold of me a couple of weeks ago and had a great idea for doing a Revolutions Per Movie episode. And sadly, that is not going to happen. He passed away last week. But he wanted to do a replacements documentary that hadn't been done. It was in his head. He knew what he wanted to call it. He knew what would be in it, why it should be made, why it couldn't be made, and I thought it was brilliant. And it got me to talking to Victor Krummenacher, who was here. Victor is a musician who's been in Camper Van Beethoven, Monks of Doom, The Third Mind, and is a lifer. And we have a Patreon for Revolutions Per Movie, since we're an independently funded program where we do exclusive shows. And one of the shows we do is Coffee with Krummenacher, talking about his times, basically his life in music, but also jumping around at various times, like tell me about your work with Eugene Chadbourne. Tell me about the time you backed Tiny Tim. And one of the things that has happened in Victor's life is Victor got to know and tour with Mojo Nixon. And we wanted to make this episode available to everybody instead of on the Patreon, just to kind of do a tribute to Mojo Nixon. It was amazing to see how many people have been writing lovely things. You know, I even heard from Ann Magnuson, who starred with him in Great Balls of Fire and said he was fantastic to work with. Victor, good to see you. You have your coffee?
I do. My coffee is right here.
What we do with Coffee with Krummenacher is Victor usually does not know what we're going to talk about. I spring various aspects.
Except
this time. Did you know Mojo before Camper Van Beethoven started touring with him? What's your trajectory with Mojo?
Well, it's been interesting because, he just, so Mojo died after he was on the Outlaw Country Cruise, obviously, because I work with Dave Alvin and a number of people in that scene. I know a ton of people on that cruise. And Mojo's manager, Scott, AKA Bullethead, was an old friend as well. And, we just got wind that, he played what was by all accounts a great gig, and then, was shut down the bar in typical Mojo fashion, and then had breakfast, which was probably, in Mojo, like biscuits and gravy, a couple of fried eggs, and then had a cardiac event. And that was that. And on some levels, from knowing Mojo, that makes sense, but obviously I've been in contact with a lot of people because he was very close with a lot I knew, including Dave, Cindy B. Berryhill, all the camper guys. I mean, he was a big part of our lives. I cannot remember the first time we played with him. I do know it was 1986. Camper Van Beethoven and Mojo played a lot. I would say 30 shows, if not more. Over a course of a few years. Mojo Nixon and his partner at the time, Skid Roper, were on Fancher Booking, which was Frank Riley's booking agency. And so we just got hooked up at a certain point, and I would venture to say it was probably around the time, it was probably after we'd done the first national touring, and maybe we're going to have to do the second or so national, which I think you saw.
Yes.
So Jonathan Sagal had put up a flyer of us playing at UC Davis, and I think that's from June of '86. So I think it dates back to that. I mean, it was certainly, it's been interesting talking to you about stuff that's happened to me, because I'm starting to see, wow, memories, it's like Swiss cheese. It's interesting what I remember, what I don't. But I do remember Mojo staying at my house. I lived in this kind of rundown house of musicians, imagine such a thing, in Santa Cruz called Hubbard Street. It was 130 Hubbard Street. And it was a former nursery school The front door didn't lock. Everybody's individual rooms had padlocks on the door. The house had been a nursery school. All the rooms were painted primary colors, so blue, orange, green. One of my housemates, I think we're past the statute of limitations. There were a lot of mushrooms in the house, which fit Mojo really well, because it's kind of one of the secrets of funding yourself when you have no money and are living in a band situation. I'm sure people are still doing it, but yeah, they stayed there. They stayed at my other house on May Street. So there were a couple of years. Mojo opened for us at the Fillmore.
Oh, wow.
I know we played Northwest because I have very clear memories of being in Corvallis with Mojo.
And what did your audience think of Mojo?
Well, so I think this is important to kind of bring up, and it revealed itself slowly. When we first started playing with Mojo, I watched him first couple times. It's like, it's kind of simple. What is this? I don't really get it. Because it's kind of silly, and I'm not really a silly guy. Even though Camper had the silly element, I was always kind of fighting against it. At least more Interstellar Overdrive at the very least. I wanted more noise. I wanted more volume. I wanted more kind of sonic insanity. And Let's Take the Skinheads Bowling. Although, what do I know? Because that song proves to be very important over time. And my attitude has changed a lot, but that was me at the time. Watching Mojo continually, you started to see that it wasn't just the music, it was his interaction with the crowd. And not only his interaction with the crowd, but the way he could take an audience and both insult them and get them on his side at the same time. And I think as a frontman that is a very particular thread to walk.
Oh, yeah.
In general, I have learned the crowd is mostly on your side, unless you go completely rogue and insult them so egregiously and so violently that there's no recovery. And I certainly have worked with a couple of frontmen who were quite capable of doing these things. Mojo could both insult them and get them on his side. And he had this song, part of the act, however you want to refer to it, where I'm a mushroom maniac, and he would get a 5-gallon plastic water bottle and start beating on it and go into the crowd. And he's basically playing a Bo Diddley beat and doing a vocal improvisation about how he liked to take mushrooms. And I watched him continually get audiences completely on his side after he'd gone and basically insulted them, made a pass at a woman in the front row, done some very, I think I'm surprised Mojo wasn't canceled at a certain point, but I think his star had faded. And he'd learned how to work media. He was a radio DJ, so I think he's a smart guy. So what we didn't know, and we discovered because as we hung out with him more and found out, he went by, his actual name was Kirby. I think his first name was actually Neil. But once Kirby kind of revealed himself, I don't know if he graduated with this degree or not, but he had a religious studies background. And one of the things he had really focused on was shamanism.
Huh.
Right? And it was a serious aspect of what the guy did. I think one of the reasons that Mojo resonated so much, and one of the reasons that people are mourning his passing so much, is that there was a real thesis to this guy. He would come across, he's one of those people. He didn't cross as intellectual, but very much was. And especially if you hung out with him, and we hung out a fair chunk. There was a deep, thoughtful side to him, a very kind side, but he was a complete maniac, And I think one of the things in talking with people in the last couple of days is, Jonathan Sagal from Camper raised the point: do they even make people like this anymore? And I think that's a good point. Another friend of ours kind of pointed out that Mojo was as much kind of out of like kind of the Ginsberg, Burroughs, Kinky Friedman, the wild man. Right, he was a distinct personality who basically what I'm trying to say is that Mojo represented a kind of artist that doesn't exist anymore, right? That is now going extinct. Like, we are in the era of control, right? We're in the era of everything being manicured and choreography on stage. And, people, I often have people like, I saw like Sufjan Stevens, and like, they're talking to me about the light show,
Right.
right? Mojo's from an era where we didn't have the money to care, and part of what you did to elevate yourself was, you embodied a personality, and he had a really distinct one and a really interesting one, and it came out of a really, I think, long and great tradition of, there's a particular thing about the American artist. I think there can be negative sides to this, but American, like rugged American individualism, does spring something very important, and I think that's why American art often is so important and so cutting edge, because we're such a crazy society. But part of America allows and has kind of idolized individualism, or at least did. I think in some ways that's changing, and I don't think that's a good thing. And I think Mojo represented a through line to an older kind of personality.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's important to note, because I think, especially when he was in the clubs, especially at the period of time where we were really working, he was pulling something over on people that I don't think they entirely understood, that it is resonating with them now, because I think they realize what they lost, but there's a lot of depth to it.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, it seems like it might have been the first time where there was no separation between stage and audience. If you didn't come through the punk rock world and you're in college or something like that, and you're starting to dip your toe into what is the underground culture, that might have been your entryway. And the fact that, like, on his writers that people have been putting up, it's very simple, very sweet. He's just like, don't mess with the audience, and we want lights up the whole entire time. We don't want any smoke. We just want to see the audience. We want them to see us. It was really simple. It kind of created his own magic, and it seems like all these people are coming forward being like, I just adored him. He won me over.
Well, it's reductionist in its nature, and the way that kind of Jonathan Richman is. It's like he was up there. It's like him and Skid. It's basically washed up bass and a Gibson hollow body guitar through a twin reverb. Props. He's got a 5-gallon water bottle that he's beating on. He's got a television that he puts over his head for stuffing Martha's muffin. It was very humble, but it was done with. He had talk about energy. The guy was just like, bouncing around on the stage night after night, and drunk. It's like, even when I was young and capable of dealing with, putting myself through a lot, I couldn't keep up. I don't have the energy reserves of a Mojo Nixon. I never did. And it was interesting because, Dave Alvin was in the Pleasure Barons with him, and he posted a video of Mojo and Country Dick singing a song called Death Train, which is apt because they're both gone now. But, Dave just said at that point, these guys are going so hard. Dave, who's not known for being short of energy on stage, would just go and have a smoke and have a beer and just like let them go. Wow. You're talking some people who burn pretty hard.
Yeah.
And I think, you do pay for it. And I think Mojo did pay for it, but I think that's kind of, he stuck to his gun. That's who Mojo was. If there's a hereafter, he's not looking back going like, oh, wow, what a drag. In retrospect, really appreciate is that Mojo and Bullethead Scott, his manager, like really kept this. They kept the personality of Mojo going through, both kind of indie rock phase. Then they had kind of a rock and roll phase. And then you had like the radio DJ phase and, the documentary, which I think is worth seeing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I will put a link in the show notes to it.
And I think the Mojo Manifesto does kind of indeed hint at like stuff I'm talking about, which is, kind of there's a deep philosophy in this, which is, to live an authentic life,
Yeah.
And it's why when, as somebody who works a day job and who still is insane enough to do this and often is wondering like, should I just give up and go for the W-2? I can't ever seem to bring myself to do it, but I've had people I work with go, man, I wish I had your life. And I'm like, I don't think you do, because there's a definitive, I could have a lot more money in the bank, and I have money in the bank compared to a lot of people I know who've done this, and it's an interesting, it's a careful what you wish for thing, that the authenticity definitely comes with a price.
Yeah.
And I think Mojo knew that, and I think he was quite lucky in kind of going the radio DJ route and pursuing stuff. There was definitely, there's a few stories. Camper and Beethoven were. Do you remember the Bob magazine?
Oh yeah, that was a Boston-based magazine, correct?
Yeah,
flexi discs and stuff in it.
Yeah, they did flexi discs. So there's a Camper and Beethoven, Mojo Nixon flexi disc. His song is Two Below something, I can't remember. We did our Love Is Like a Porpoise Mouth, the country Joe song. And anyhow, the Bob requested that we do a joint photo session with Mojo and Skid. And we were both on tour. I think we were actually going out to meet R.E.M, as I recall.
You're on separate tours?
We're on separate tours.
Okay.
And so, this is pre-cell phone.
Right.
And so we're talking with Scott Riley and trying to figure out where they're coming west and we're going east to meet R.E.M, and where are we going to cross paths?
Uh-huh.
And we realized that close to Little America in Wyoming was where we would be able to cross paths. So we basically timed our drive so that we would basically wake up in Little America around the time that Mojo and Skid and Scott would be there and do a photo shoot. It's a beautiful photo. I mean, I have like the silliest expression on my face, but I think we're laying on the ground in a circle. Our heads are all in a circle, kind of, very Monkees or kind of like 1966 Beatles-esque. And Scott took the photo. But it was a fond memory. And just the fact that these guys were such good sports, that's hard, especially in that era. That's hard to coordinate, and
yeah.
There's no way to check. He was like, are they going to be here? Because, you can't like text somebody. He's like, are you there? We'll see, and like, so we pulled that off. And then, just a lot of fun times touring. We did a Northwest tour. I think it was later that year. And, there were a lot of mushrooms circulating. And, I used to like to eat a couple of stems of mushrooms before we played. And it was a pretty typical thing for me to do. Not get too high, but just a little buzz. Mojo's mushroom technique was a little bit more, as we would say, towards the committed dose. Uh-huh. So we're playing Oregon State, and we were playing in this. It was one of those old frat houses on that campus. Like it's been there. It was probably built in 1890s, kind of brick, and it's like December in Oregon, as you know well, how lovely.
Oh yeah, it's toasty.
Toasty, yeah, wet. We're playing this old academic building, and we're staying in a frat house. And Oregon State is not the University of Oregon. It's kind of got the anti-Grateful Dead overtone to it. And so Mojo and I were kind of high, and we were walking around, and the crowd was verging on pretty frat boy. And you know what it's like to play like an old, like not well maintained academic hall where, the seats are kind of, they squeak and the walls are kind of stained, and you're like, what is that stain? Is that water or is that something else? And like the floor is completely, the finish is long gone off the floor. It's just buildings seen better days. And so anyhow, Mojo and I are walking around, and he's like, Krumlacher, you see this? See those guys? See those guys in there? And he's pointing at like the frat boys in the audience. He's like, see that's the bad punchline. Those guys, that's the bad punchline. The questionable gig circumstances, bad punchline. See that? Points up at the sky. It's a December Oregon sky, cloud drenched stars barely like shining their way through. He's like, that's the good punchline. That was Mojo, and that was kind of one of my favorite evenings with him. But he stayed at my house a couple of times, and in more kind of psychedelic adventures. There were a lot of mushrooms in my house, and in fact, we kept a bottle of orange juice because psilocybin will leach into the orange juice. It's a really good. It's transductive, I think is the word. Basically, okay. Put mushrooms in orange juice. The acid in the orange juice will leach the psilocybin into the orange juice, so you don't have to eat the mushrooms. Just get it's the same principle as mushroom tea, but the acid is more efficient than the hot water.
Just get the goodness.
So, Mojo and Skid and Scott's girlfriend were staying at this kind of crash pad I lived in, and we had done a bunch of mushrooms, and we were sitting on the couch and watching TV and playing like old soul records. It was genuinely kind of a good time. But so Scott had his girlfriend, so obviously, we didn't where's the couple going to go hook up? And well, we're going to go out in the van. So they go out in the van, and Skid and Mojo sleep on. We had called the couch the acid couch. So I think Mojo slept on the acid couch, and I'm sure Skid just kind of slept on the floor or something. But
why was it called the acid couch?
Because there was a lot of acid done on that couch.
So. Okay, I just wanted to make sure. I wanted to make sure it was that simple. Sorry.
Considine first record, there's a song on there called "Visions from the Acid Couch," and just so you know, if the photograph of me on the cover of Our Beloved Revolutionary Sweetheart, where I'm looking at the TV, kind of slightly baked, that was taken in this living room. So that was taken at Hubbard Street by my friend Edie Winograde. So nonetheless, Scott and his girlfriend sleep in the van, and Mojo and Skid are in the house. And apparently in the evening, Scott's girlfriend had to pee, but she didn't want to get up, put on her clothes and crawl in the house. So she's digging around in the van, and she finds this bottom of a half gallon of milk, cut loose. It's a little box, and she's like, well, hell, I'll just pee in this. She pees in it, throws it out the door. And the next morning, I'm making breakfast. Hubbard Street we like to make breakfast was the good meal. So you just a lot of fried bacon, a lot of eggs. Mojo and Scott are all about bacon and eggs, but Skid, was more I have some cereal out in the van. So he goes out to the van and is going to go eat his cereal. And Scott Riley comes in and he's like, you got to see this. And so we go out and he's eating cereal out of the box that Scott's girlfriend had taken a leak in the night before. And of course, these guys, I'm like, should we tell him? Oh, no, don't tell him. And Scott's like, so what are you doing with that box? He's like, oh, yeah, this is my cereal box. I found it in the gutter. Somebody must have thrown it out. You guys got to be careful with my cereal box. That was Skid. And that was just a kind of a typical episode of hanging out with Mojo. So Skid, I know you're still around. I'm sorry. But yeah, so those are the kind of memories that we had. And also just in as far as just the transcendental nature of Mojo on stage, above and beyond Frankie and Skid, we played the Fillmore with Mojo. And, everything that I was talking about that was in effect I saw him do this so many times, but basically took that crowd, and that was close to sold out shows. So you're talking 1,000 people, and he had them in the palm of his hand.
Yeah. Just
completely capable of leading a group of people, of getting people focused on him, focused on what he was doing, and having a really good time, and in the most, in a silly but yet kind of profound way, right? In a way that just, as good music does, as good performance does, you forget about time, you forget about your place, you forget about what's going on, and you just get into that moment. And so that
Yeah.
2 is a really, really great memory of, and that Fillmore show, I think my dad's third marriage had happened, and I like flew in, and I was completely like sleepless and crazy, and I remember, because it was our first chance to open or to headline the Fillmore, and I'm like, my dad's getting married, and like Frank Riley's like, I don't care who's getting married, you have to make that show, right? So I
Right.
go and do this wedding. I'm completely like out of my mind, and we played that show, and just I had great memories of Mojo just kind of pulling the crowd in, and in a lot of ways he got them on our side before we didn't have to do any work, right? It was just
Yeah, I was going to say, being in Guided by Voices, we often had that too. We had amazing openers that, New Pornographers, The Strokes, My Morning Jacket, The Shins. It was always kind of awesome when you had a really cool opening band that you liked their energy or their songs. And you could kind of be like, all right, let's go do our thing. I always appreciated when there was a really fantastic opening band.
Yeah, it's a great thing, and I think that's why we wound up working with Mojo so much. It's just like it was very Mojo and Camper were very compatible. I think people,
Yeah.
There's I was complaining about Take the Skinheads bowling earlier, but there's especially as you get older, it's like you start to understand the importance of levity, and then there's a certain profundity there that we had a good time, and that's what it's about.
And I want to touch on something that Jonathan said to you earlier. Do they make people like this anymore? I'm sure they do. I just don't know them. They're probably in the underground somewhere. But do you think there could ever be another Mojo Nixon?
Well, I wonder, and I hope so. I think your thesis that maybe they do make people like this still, I think it's true. I think there are a lot of people who are not born to follow rules, who just don't have that inclination. But we're highly indoctrinated now, in ways that we weren't when we grew up, because of technology and because of how omnipresent it is. Social media and cell phones particularly, I think, are something that it's something to be concerned about, and I think Mojo came about at a point, Mojo's about 10 years older than me. It came about at a point in time where it just wasn't really even on the radar, where the ability to kind of run rampant. It was just economically, you were able to access a quality of living, being an outsider, that I think is harder to do now, and I think it's actually an economic argument.
Right.
But I do, I have a lot of younger friends who realize what kind of what a game it is, in a not good way right now.
Sure.
You're how old's Riley now? 22? Like
26.
Oh, right. Yeah. See.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. They know. They get it. They understand. And so, I think we can only, as people who grew up in that and can appreciate it, it's our job to advocate for, people who don't fit in boxes. Because
I agree.
The world's better when you don't fit in a box, and I think that's why we are all missing Mojos, because you never really fit in a box.
I always had a big love also for people who were accidentally successful and weirdos, and he's the perfect example. That film, The Mojo Manifesto, shows completely how he was driven, but he would still be playing this kind of music without success.
Yeah.
He seemed driven to just do his thing. And then there was a period where the world caught on.
Right.
And they followed him. And then, of course, longevity in music is very fleeting.
Oh, yeah.
But the fact that he created kind of an amazing band for the rest of his career, a 4-piece, and that they spoke the same language. They knew how to turn it on, and they just went. They would just go, 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 go. Is impressive, even as they were seeing like audiences kind of dwindle, and shrinking, which is a part of being a lifelong musician. Is, at some point, for most bands, your popularity starts decelerating.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's very, very hard to maintain. And Mojo really stuck to his guns, but Martha Quinn, God bless her, I mean, that was really an avenue. Like he was, there was a period of time in like 87 where, he was definitely kind of starting to eclipse where Camper was at that point. I mean,
Yeah.
Really essentially stopped playing because, he had grown into, headlining his own shows and getting his own money. And like, and that's kind of where we diverged. I mean, we certainly stayed in touch. And then, when he stopped working with Skid and, that first 4-piece that he took in the studio, I mean, that was Roscoe Amble and John Doe and Country Dick on drums. This is that's not a slouchy band by any means, and it really rock and roll, but like really good players doing it.
Yeah. And it came up in the email that he wrote to me about making that record and his choice of producer on that record.
Jim Dickinson.
And so, we were talking back and forth about, I was like, this is what here are some of the films that other artists on the show have picked. Peter Buck, looked at, the R.E.M. documentary he hadn't seen, John Cameron Mitchell looking at Gimme Shelter. And people have done narrative films that are music-based, like Beyond the Valley of Dolls or Velvet Goldmine, or they've done documentaries or the art of the music video. And this is what he wrote back. Dude, I could do Woodstock or Jimi Hendrix, both of which I saw 10 times at the midnight movies in high school, or either the Shane Pogues doc. But what I really want to talk about is a doc not made yet, The Replacements. Filmmaker Robert Gordon told me he had millions in backing money, and Paul said no. I would like to talk about why we need a Replacements documentary, what would be in it, what would it be called. We would tie in the recent box sets and remixes, what made The Replacements so great. I hired Jim Dickinson to produce me because of The Replacements. And we can also talk about my movie, The Mojo Manifesto, Mojo, and then his phone number. And I was like, for him to think outside the box for this show was so touching to me that he was like, I get your show, but I have an idea. I was like, that was so brilliant. And I kept telling people, Mojo Nixon's coming on. They're like, oh, wow. And I said, yeah, but check this out. He wants to talk about an imaginary replacement documentary that's in his head. I was so excited. I'm just dying what it would have been called, what he saw in it. But the fact that he was like, he loved music. He was obsessed with The Replacements still.
Yeah.
Mojo Nixon was a known thing that was still going. And he was like, still like, The Replacements were the greatest band ever. I love that.
Yeah. I mean, but that's Mojo, it's just like, he's kind of guy, he's going to come at you with an angle, right? It's not necessarily, but I mean, I think that's where your show accelerates, is like going with the angles, and he got it right away, and I think that's just part of the magic of the guy. And now I'm like, I just read that Trouble Boys book and talk about a dour landscape with The Replacements. Like I want to know what his angle on it was, because
I was excited to talk about it too, because I told Bob Muir, the writer of that book, I love that book.
Yeah, it's great.
And one day I was like, I want to read it, but I just read it recently. And what I decided to do was I read it backwards, chapter by chapter, Rashomon style. And so what I would do was I'd read the end, and then I would go to the next chapter, and it would be like, the beginning of the chapter, you'd be like, oh, this is where Bob is no longer in it. He's just, but you get it backwards, and it was perfect. And I told Bob that. I said, your book is as good forward as it is backwards. And then Bob was like, that is one of the nicest compliments anyone's ever said about that book. It's amazing. And yeah, again, I just love that in Mojo's mind, he was dying to have something made about, his favorite band.
And he had a universe that he believed in, and I, the Replacements were definitely part of it, and the other thing too, you raised it briefly, but talking about the Shane MacGowan documentary, he wanted, I think he opened for the Pogues, and like him.
Yes, he was tight with them.
Very interesting because, I had some minimal Pogue exposure, and I thought about this a few times, like, man, it was weird enough being around Shane in my own right. What was it like with Mojo and Shane? Like, how insane was that? I can only imagine. I would have loved to have been the fly on that wall, but
yeah. I'm assuming they were brothers.
Oh, yeah, I bet so. I was just a shy kid hanging out in the backstage, but like Mojo didn't do that shit, so.
Right.
Probably a deep hangover to start.
Just a bit.
Just a bit.
Just a bit. You sent me a file that I will put in this episode of Mojo Nixon performing live, and somewhere almost near the end of the set, he does a Camper Van Beethoven song. Anything about the story behind that? Because it is bonkers.
It is bonkers, and it's great. And it was just surfaced to me by my friend Little Mike right after Mojo died. Mojo, when we used to play with each other, sometimes he would do the "don't do that," where he'd like hint at "take the Skinheads Bowling" or throw because Skinheads Bowling is like 2 chords, and he's just going to start singing it, and you're like, hint it, and you're like, you're not supposed to do that. And he just didn't care.
So he teased the audience with like, here you go, but no.
Yeah, or just, he was always like that, or Ambiguity song. I remember hinting at that. He certainly played with us a lot. And a lot of our songs are pretty simple, so he probably had them figured out. But I had not heard that, and it was just super touching because it's just like it's a completely gonzo version. What's the intro? It's like longer than the intro of the song is longer than the song itself.
It's true, and he's just screaming in pain.
Yeah,
and it's just it is a. Again, like you would expect, it's not a traditional cover. It's only from his mind, and it completely, if you didn't know it was a Camper cover, you would have been like, this is a killer Mojo Nixon song.
Right.
I don't know what this is. This isn't on anything. Or maybe he just made it up on the spot.
Well, he was making up half of it on the spot. It's a beautiful thing because it just really... that's testimony to his spontaneity and his intelligence and sense of humor and all of the good things that made him, the legendary person that he was, and still is.
Well, Victor, thank you so much for coming on and talking about your times with Mojo Nixon. It was really amazing to see the outpouring of love and energy for him. It seems like he would just be floored by the amount of people who just miss him and really appreciated what he was giving to this world. And definitely he took up a lot of space, and there's a lot of space on Earth now that he's gone. Yeah, so
we definitely are left with a void, but I appreciate you coming up with this idea. It was good to talk about him. He was definitely, Camper doesn't always agree on things, but I think we all agree that Mojo was very important to us, and was a really good time hanging out with him, and we'll definitely miss the guy.
Indeed. Thanks so much, Victor.
Thank you, Chris.